Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's been a while and I've been going through my backlog of recorded paintings and I figured I'd start going through them one by one. So this is going to be a short video about how I create a cyberpunk motorbike concept. I was very much inspired by the bikes that I saw in Akira and also the recent Cyberpunk video game. So when it comes to designing bikes, I prefer designing them from the side view, and I like to start with just looking at a good array of different real-world bikes and also prototype bikes out there. I do think when it comes to designing vehicles, especially bikes or cars that have wheels, you want to start with the core proportions, which are the wheelbase. That's essentially what I'm starting now. I'm just grabbing a set of wheels and a basic seating area just to give myself a jump start of the proportion and size ratio of this design. To be honest, I didn't really have much of a clear idea in mind for this, so as I was recording this or painting this, I was really just letting things go with the flow. And so you'll see me bounce around back and forth quite a bit as I'm jumping around different wheels, different photographs, and generally different proportions for the bike. But I do think this is quite a natural way of starting. My motto when it comes to design, no pun intended, is to really just quickly block things out using pictures and just kind of let things visualize right in front of you. The good thing about every photographs is that you can keep everything in layers. As such, you can move things around and come up with a lot of quick iterations before you decide on anything concrete. So in my canvas now, I have a very basic setup with two wheels, almost a basic fuselage and a kind of a seating. But I'm still deciding with the position of the main body or chassis. I was looking a lot at the Akira bike concepts done by Aaron Beck. I think he did one in particular which really caught my eye. So that was one of the main inspirations for this concept. But obviously, I was aiming to do something of my own. I do wanted to create my own shape language for this, so you'll see me play around with it quite a bit. In my mind, initially, I was thinking of making it very much proportionately a Japanese superbike, but that eventually changed as I started to play around with the proportions further. But I definitely wanted it to have a rather aggressive silhouette, obviously, and a very, very lightweight frame. I definitely didn't want it to be too heavy of a build, and I wanted to play with an idea of very strong, blocky suspension arms in the back and front of the vehicle design. So as I'm designing this vehicle, you can see that once I've started blocking out the position of the wheels and the position of the general chassis, I started to fill up the in-between gaps with the connecting arms, as well as starting to add the gearbox or transmission of the bike. And because I kept everything in layers, I could still easily move things around, play around the proportions until I get something that I find appealing. But very much this first stage is all about exploration and trying to find an interesting outcome and being very loose and free with your design. I would say majority of the time was spent here because as a concept artist, majority of your value comes in solving the loose design. The render and polish tends to be something that can be addressed later. You really want to invest as much time and thought, I guess, as during these early stages of the design stage. So I have only a few references in frame at the moment. These are the bikes that I thought, either from a feeling perspective or from a texture standpoint, that I did see some interesting things. But by no means am I locked to this particular references. References are good to inform you on how the world works, how logic works, but they shouldn't really influence your design too much, especially right now when you're trying to create your own shape language. And especially since this is a quite a fantasy, cyberpunk, science fiction theme, I have a lot more freedom to explore otherworldly combinations. And so you can see me here really experimenting with different positions. I'm using the transform tool and the warp tool to kind of just move things around and warp things and rotate things until I get an interesting position. Ideally, if you're working with a client for this, or if this is a paid commission, you might want to save all of your iterations. That way you can kind of create several thumbnails, because you might want to bring your client along with the design process. But in this case, I was just designing for myself. So I was just moving things around. And since I was technically the client, the silhouette that I liked the most was the one that I went with, obviously. So here I've kept the values really dark as well, so that I'm mainly thinking about silhouettes and the base forms. But I am starting to think about adding some more key iconic features. And I thought this barrel or tube position at the lower section of the bike, kind of near the air ventilation or transmission, I thought was a pretty cool shape language. So I wanted to make sure that was blocked in early on. So you can see me again messing around with the proportions of the bike and jumping back and forth and cutting out parts that I thought was interesting. I think bikes are a very interesting topic to design, because no matter how futuristic you go, the general anatomy of a bike has to remain the same, or has to remain generally the same. As long as you have a human-shaped driver or pilot, you're going to have some kind of a seating area. And if you're limiting yourself to two wheels, essentially a traditional bike proportion, then that's also going to shape a lot of the general proportions. And so here I think this is where I really started to kind of nail the shape. I really liked that Ducati-esque fuselage right behind the handlebars. That particular curve to me was quite a nice traditional homage to real world bikes. And so once I had that, I could start to play around with the rest of the silhouettes and push them a little bit further and still have it look like a instant bike. And that's a personal preference of mine. I like when my designs, even though they're not meant to be real, I do like a certain part of it to be immediately readable as something you recognize. And this way, every other part surrounding it can be a bit more crazy, a bit more otherworldly, and I can just have a bit more fun with it. So this orange pipe or kind of cable that's attached from the main chassis to the wheels somewhat symbolizes this being an electric bike. So there won't be any exhaust or fuel burning in this vehicle. So it's going to be a rather modern kind of bike. So that bright yellow orange cable is a nice indicator to show that this is an electric vehicle. On top of that is a great color and shape to break all of the angular forms that are already present in the design. And it's very much inspired by the trikes, I would say, in Death Stranding, designed by Yoji Shinkawa and his team. Absolutely gorgeous implementations of those cables, and that's something I really wanted to put into mine as well. So now that the general silhouette is pretty much starting to come along, I can start cutting and pasting pieces of other bike elements and just try to start to gradually flesh out the design. If you notice, my canvas is very much zoomed out. This is because I'm really trying to just focus on the core silhouettes. I don't really want I don't really want to focus on any details at the moment. I want to make sure that I'm constantly just thinking about the base shape. So I'm bringing in my favorite texture set now. This is images of from Chappie, the film, and this was by Weta Workshop, the Moose robot that they helped build. It was a Neil Blomkamp film. And I absolutely love this set of images, and I use the surface textures quite a bit. So you can see me taking this very nice machined ribbing shape from the front of the machine and popping it onto my bike. And I love adding these kind of triangular machine ribbings because they really suggest a very nice industrial look. And the triangle shapes I find just is a great way to break up the monotony of large surfaces. So every time I introduce a new texture in, I just want to spend a little bit of time making sure the color is adjusted, the values are tweaked a little bit, and the shape is matching the overall form language of my underpainting. You definitely don't want your textures to overtake your art. You want it to be other way around, obviously. Your original silhouette, the original proportion and form should always remain the king. And then whatever texture you bring in shouldn't overtake that. So best way to do it is every time you bring in a texture, just work over it before you bring in another texture, right? So generally, you definitely want to work over your textures quite a bit. Because if you're not, chances are they are going to just stick out and be rather disconnected from the rest of your design. So I'm kind of going in, adding some light. I like to use light and values to kind of help carve the surface or the shape. Because generally what we've drawn so far is a two-dimensional, well, it is still a two-dimensional drawing, but it's viewed from the side or the profile view. So we can use light to tell the audience how the actual three-dimensional shape of this vehicle is. And so by adding a little bit of light here and there, it kind of tells us that the angle is actually facing towards the light source, which is in this case, the top light, kind of like a garage light. And this gradual carving of the form is also a lovely way of, before adding any Photobash elements, just figure out what 3D shape you want first. It's very tempting to just solve everything with a photo. And I think that's the general misconception with Photobashing, is that I think people think that you can get the entire shape with a photo texture. Chances are, I mean, more like that happens rarely, I would say. You wouldn't get that perfect texture. It happens rare, and so I wouldn't depend on it. What I'll recommend instead is start with a very, very basic 3D form, in your painting. I mean, using some light and maybe just gray tones and gray values to build up a nice geometry in the painting. And then supplement that surface with selective photobashing and make sure you always work on top of your photobash textures. That way they properly integrate with the shape and surface of your design. So I'm starting to bounce around. You can see me jumping around the drawing. I don't like to dwell on one surface or one section of the design. I like to move around quite a bit. This way, I don't overwork one particular section, because a design should work together as a whole, right? You want every inch of the artwork to complement each other. So if you spend all of your time on one section, you're going to overwork that section and make the other sections become more disconnected with that particular area. So generally, just bounce around, do a little bit here, do a little bit there, and make sure that there's some holistic combination or some holistic design coherence throughout the entire design in this case. And so what I've done there is I've grabbed, I think it's some kind of a exhaust or power box on the mousse texture with the little dots, and I've turned it into a kind of like a little exhaust system on my bike. Not exhaust system, sorry. Some kind of a detail on the arm. And so I throw away my textures as well. So I'm really not precious with them. Once I pop the textures in, if I don't think they work, I'll just get rid of it. So hence, that's why it's important to just work fast, especially in these early stages. You don't really want to fall in love with any texture so soon. There is kind of like a procedurally slower pace the more you work in. So we were very, very fast, I would say, earlier when we're still deciding on the design. But I would say now we're kind of like middle to fast speed, right? So I don't want to be just randomly throwing textures together. I do want to be a little bit more conscious about it, but I don't want to fall in love with any section too much as well, because technically this is still in the early stages of deciding the design. Another tip I would say as well is every time I bring a texture in, I don't necessarily keep the color unless it's absolutely the color that I want. So when in doubt, just make it grayscale, right? Because what you want is the surface information, maybe the reflectivity or the noise. You don't really necessarily want the color. So I would recommend when you're designing something, keep it grayscale unless you're very certain about a specific item like that orange-yellow power cable. If you're not sure about something, just keep it gray because you can always add color really, really easily, honestly speaking, in Photoshop. So one less thing for you to worry about. It allows you to just focus on values, lighting, 3D form, shape, texture, right? All of these crucial things in the early stages. Color can honestly come in at the end. And one thing I like about thinking in gray values is we can start to develop some kind of hierarchy in what values are lighter, what values are darker. And so I want this round shape on the main body to kind of really pop up as a prominent shape, because I think it's a nice little graphical element having that little circle there. I think it was done in the Akira inspired bike in Cyberpunk as well. And it's a very nice trick to make your designs pop, adding a very clear graphic element like that circle in the middle of the design. Because if you look at it, the general silhouette of the bike is rather angular, right? Obviously the wheels are circular, but generally everything else is rather angular, rather geometric. And so having that very high contrast shape, which is a circle smack in the middle of the bike, makes it a very nice, interesting visual point. And so I'm gradually just kind of growing the design, building things up further. I'm also experimenting with ideas of like pipes and wirings and tubings. And you see me starting to slow down a little bit more. I would say I'm about 75 or 60% into the design. So I want to start to go easy on the gas pedal, right? And really figure out, okay, what's the next things I should add on? I should try something. And then if I don't like it, drop it right away. If I like it, keep it. But I'm going to start moving a little bit slower here because I want to make sure that I don't overdo the design, because you have to learn to be fast, but then you got to learn to slow down as well, because fast is good because you can keep changing, keep experimenting, keep seeing opportunities and ideas, potential. But then you got to learn to slow down once you're pretty happy with where you are, because if not, you're going to end up being perpetually changing your design, and we don't want that. You do want to at least at some point confirm your design. So now that I'm pretty happy with the silhouette, I can start slowing down and playing with colors, right? So you can see me here. I've added a bit of yellow to the wheel. I think I had this general color palette in mind, yellow, black, and orange, very much inspired by the Keanu Reeves Arch bike in Cyberpunk. I think it's a color scheme that always works. Vivid yellow with black and some splashes of orange here and there. So that's generally the color scheme I'm going with. But once again, in Photoshop, changing color is so easy. I wouldn't be too concerned about it. So I'm adding another of this orange cable to the back wheel to make sure that the back wheel as well is powered. And simple logic like that, I think, goes a long way. There's something deep inside of us that just understands that idea. Because essentially, anytime you're designing a science fiction design, you have to work with whatever science is available, either in the far frontier, like things are being developed or experimented on or being currently theorized, as well as things that we all understand today. And so having that balance is really important, right? You don't want to go too far and come up with something that's so alien and so abstract in terms of technology that people cannot understand. I personally like real world tech mainly, because I think that's the one that makes me personally feel more excited, because I would want a bike like this, and I can understand how a bike like this works. And I think that's a nice measurement if you want to make designs that perhaps are recognizable, understandable, right? It has to feel like it could belong in the world today. It's just that it's a few steps ahead of whatever we have today. So now that the overall texture work is somewhat established and I have quite a decent 3D shape, I'm going to start to just polish up the design further. So this back end part is just a lot of noodling, going around each part, extending the surface, shortening the surface, defining the form where it needs to be defined, basically turning what we initially had, which was a flat silhouette, into something that's a little bit more polished, has more dimension across all aspects. I'm also thinking about all of the smaller details that I may have missed out. So here, I've been thinking about maybe adding a identification number panel at the back, as well as a speedometer in the front. So that little thin line there at the handlebars is supposed to be a speedometer. But I'm being very careful with it. I'm not sure whether, because anytime you add something like this, it tends to mess around with the silhouette, and so it's always a double-edged sword, right? You definitely want to check the feel of it before committing. So I'm fine-tuning some of the small details. I decided to just paint or build this break this pattern. So nice little trick: Control Alternate Shift T in Photoshop. So basically, after you've done any transformation, right, Control T and apply transformation. If you press Control Alternate Shift T again, it will duplicate and repeat that same transformation. So that's basically how I did that little pattern there, and just added a bevel and emboss to give it some thickness and depth. Using the dodge tool to give it some shine, making that brake disc look nice and shiny and like a real brake disc. And then also applying that same yellow rim trim to the inner part of the wheel. Once again, that yellow, again, really stands out nicely because the rubber is nice and glossy and dark, and you got some nice gunmetal and silver parts. So a little bit of splashes of color. I think it's why everyone loves Cyberpunk themes, heavy metal and then big splashes of vibrant colors. So I have to start thinking about where else to add the colors. So now I'm starting to experiment with the other positions of yellow. If you think about it, it's kind of like wearing, it's like plain dress up, right? Like if you wear a yellow shoes, maybe you want to wear a yellow tie, because at least it complements each other, right? There's kind of like a nice little repertoire going across the entire design. If you wear everything yellow, your shirt's yellow, your jacket's yellow, your pants and shoes are yellow, you're going to end up, that's probably too much. And so there should be some kind of jump, right? Maybe your shoes and your hat. And the logic is essentially the same. So that's why I just made the rims yellow and the fuselage and just a tiny bit of the main chassis to be yellow. That way there's a nice little jump of sequence in between the colors. So I'm going into my finishing touches now. I'm going to my decals folder. I've accumulated a whole bunch of these decals. They're a mix of decals from Gundam model kits to some graphic elements that I found online. And I like to use them to kind of add, it's if you design anything science fiction or futuristic, these kind of decals to me add a lot of life and a lot of realism to it, because it's just something that you see in modern engineering, right? A lot of stickers, a lot of indicators about where things are. It's really a nice icing on the cake. I definitely would not underestimate the power of it. You can, however, go too far. I tend to be very, very modest with my decals. I've seen other artists pull off a much better way of decals. Really, I don't know how they do it, but I am really modest with mine. I'm still working on trying to apply more decals in my pieces. I don't think you can. I think it's definitely a skill that goes a long way, because you technically can have a very simple or bare surface and really just spruce it up with some very beautiful decals. So everything is kind of in place now. So I can kind of just start to, really slow down and start to paint, right? So this is finally the moment where I actually start painting. I have my brush open and I'm kind of blending, or not blending, I would say I'm connecting all of these secondary forms together, making sure that things are not too abstract, like there's clear separation between all of the important segments or parts. Right, and painting is really good for that, because there's no point to photobash all those tiny things. I'm also starting to think about presentation, so I'm adding a simple gradient map here, just to make sure that there's some ambient or environment lighting that I'm thinking about. And I'm probably gonna just use a basement photo to just put the vehicle something, like put it like in some kind of a world. And it's going to be a very subtle effect because this bike concept is very loose. It's a very rough piece of concept. So if I use too much of the photo, it's just going to make the looseness of it stand out even more. So I don't really want that. As such, I'm just grabbing a texture, but I'm going to make it really, really faint. So you can see I'm going to just erase most of it because I just want a tiny bit of noise in that background. So now I'm just building a very simple top-down cast shadow. So I'm using, this is a technique I learned from Aaron Beck. We're just actually using the square marquee tool to draw a very simple top-down shadow. So this is basically what the shadow cast would look like if you're looking top-down. And so I think it's very easy to do this. That's why I really love this technique, right? Because rather than drawing the shadows in perspective, you draw it top down. It's a little bit more straightforward. I think it's a little bit easier to understand. So what you do is like you fill it up with black or a dark value, add a tiny bit of motion blur, and you want to position it underneath with all the correct distortion. And for something like this, it should work out just right. So you can see me distorting the flat texture in and forcing in the perspective using the transform distort tool. So you want to make sure the values of your shadow are appropriate. It's not too dark, not too light. And that's why I had to build in a environment value first, right? Because ideally, your shadow should be defined based on the overall value and contrast of your environment. So without a decent environment, it's going to be really hard to judge what is the correct values for your concept and especially for your cast shadows. So I'm just dropping the values of the background even more so that the yellow and the gunmetal of the design pops, and basically just framing this up, adding a little bit of unsharp mask, and gonna apply some of my lens correction, and basically this is the final concept. So I hope you enjoyed this quick tutorial, and if you found this content useful, Please like and subscribe and stay tuned for more. Take care.